Hi, and welcome to Mr. Fisher's Biology Podcast. This podcast looks at supporting evidence for the theory of evolution today. We're going to look at a series of examples in this podcast that illustrate evidence for the idea that organisms change over time or they evolve. And we're going to start with the fossil record, because the fossil record is a very good indication of how evolution has occurred over time. We can't go back in time to look at organisms and trace how they've changed. There's just way too much time. We're talking millions of years. But what we can do is see examples of organisms that have lived before within the fossil record and compare those with organisms that currently exist. So the fossils are organized into layers, and they're usually found in sedimentary rock. And we can notice that fossils that are lower in the strata of the sedimentary rock are older than fossils that are higher up. And we can compare fossils from lower areas to fossils with higher areas, and we can see the changes that have occurred over that amount of time. And we may be talking about millions of years with, even in this type of strata. So the fossil record really shows us how organisms change over time, but also we can compare organisms that exist today with fossilized organisms. So this is a sea urchin that existed 65 million years ago, and it's very, very similar to modern day sea urchins. Another example of some supporting evidence for evolution is the idea of industrial melanism. So I talked a little bit about this in the previous podcast on Darwin and evolution. What happened in England, this is a pepper moth, by the way, and pepper moths have two alleles. There is an allele that allows pepper moths to be white, and then there's an allele that allows pepper moths to be black. Pre-industrialization, trees in England looked like this. And what we found was that there was a higher amount of white pepper moths and a lower amount of black pepper moths in terms of the allele. So we didn't see them that often. We saw more white pepper moths than we saw black. When the Industrial Revolution came in and all the soot that was pumped out of the factories, they began to turn the trees black. And something dramatic happened, and this is an example of some evolution that has occurred in a very short amount of time because the moths began to change in amount. So where the white moths before were white, we now see a decrease in the white moths because, as you can see, if you're a white moth on a black tree, you're more easily picked off by birds. Now, conversely, whereas the black moth was exposed on the black trees, or on the white trees, sorry, on the black trees, they were well protected. So the black moth increased, or the black allele. And so in a very short amount of time, we see that one trait can be selected for and change that organism's appearance over a very short amount of time. Now, today, the trees have all been sort of cleaned up as the factories have developed standards to prevent pollution. And so we're seeing a shift today back to the white pepper moth being the dominant genotype and the black pepper moth decreasing. Homologous structures are another example for support for evolution. Homologous structures are structures that are descended from common ancestry. So for example, if we look at the forelimbs in mammals, we can see that the bone structure is very similar. So it doesn't matter if the organism is a whale or a cat or say a bat or a gorilla. We see very common bone types and very common bone structures. This suggests that at one point all of these organisms here had some sort of common ancestor, and that they evolved over time. Embryonic development is a very good example of common ancestry. So these are the embryos of different types of vertebrate animals. And we can see that at some point, and it's different for every organism what point this is, but at some point in the development of an organism, they all look very similar. So here's the embryo of a pond turtle, and here's the embryo of a human being at some point. So at some point in a human's development, we could say that they were very similar looking to that of a pond turtle, or a chicken, or a domestic cat. And this suggests that, again, we've probably all descended from common ancestry. And we can see that within our embryos. A really good example is the pesticide resistance. So we see very quickly how insects can become resistant to insecticides that we apply onto fields. As some of the insects die out, the ones that are able to survive are also able to reproduce, and over time we have resistant insects. And that's an example of an organism and how it changes over time or evolves. A scary one is the evolution of drug resistance in viruses like HIV, but also in things like tuberculosis. As we begin to subject people to different types of antibiotics, bacteria and viruses evolve as well to become resistant to those bacteria. And we're starting to see a resurgence in diseases like tuberculosis, in diseases like smallpox, once thought eradicated, are now coming back and are showing resistances to our old treatments. And finally, now that we understand a little bit of DNA, the human genome has been sequenced, we can look at similarities in DNA. And this is looking at a particular gene, the cytochrome C oxidase gene. But the important thing to note is that the differences in the number of nucleotide bases in some organisms is very small. So if we compare a human and a pig, there's only 13 base difference. Human and a duck, there's only 17 bases difference. Human and yeast, which is one of the lower organisms that we have on the planet, there's only 66 nucleotides. That's the difference between a human and a yeast looking at that particular gene. Really good example of common ancestry. So that's supporting evidence that we have for the theory of evolution.